Hello, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon webinar with Brainwaves. Thank you so much for joining us. It's fantastic that you're able to join us this afternoon. I can see that there's lots of new people joining for the very first time to a Brainwaves webinar, so welcome. My name is Tracy, I'm from Brainwaves, and I'm going to be your host this afternoon. Today, we're going to be talking about supporting neurodiverse students and mental health. And to do that, I'm delighted to welcome Laura Kirby. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Tracy. Thank you very much for having me.
Amazing to have Laura today. Laura is the founder of PAST, which stands for Positive Assessment, Support and Training, which provides training and support to neurodivergent individuals and their families. Laura has been working with autistic children and young people for over 20 years to ensure that their learning needs are fully met. She's also the author of The Teen's Guide to PDA. If you haven't come across PDA before, it's pathological demand avoidance, which is a subtype of autism on the spectrum disorder. So, and I believe that book was published this summer, Laura. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. Yeah, so that was published in June, and then last year I also published the Educator's Experience of PDA as well. So it's my second book on PDA.
So yeah, people today, they can choose whichever one they want,
Yeah.
the Teens Guide or the Educator's Guide. Amazing. So today then, the structure is that Laura is going to be speaking with slides for about 45 minutes. Laura has very kindly offered to share her slides, but does so under the request that those aren't really shared much wider and aren't used for other training purposes. So thank you, Laura, for that. That's brilliant. We are hoping to have about 10 minutes at the end for questions. So as always, you're very welcome to join in the chat and make comments there. The only suggestion is that you make sure you share with everybody so we can all see what you're typing. But if you'd like to ask a question to Laura at the very end, can I ask that you use the Q&A button, which you should see along the bottom. If you type in your question there, that just really helps me keep all the questions organized in one place. So thank you in advance for that. So just before we start, we wanted to ask you all a quick question about how familiar you actually are with this concept of neurodiversity. Is it something you're very familiar with professionally, personally, or is it something you've only vaguely heard about and would like to learn more? So you should see the poll appearing now. Hopefully you can see that. There's 4 options. And if you just give you a couple of moments to take part in that, it's completely anonymous, so we don't know who's answering what. It's just really helpful for us to gauge your level of knowledge before we start the webinar. Great, so I can see that a fair amount of you have answered. What we are seeing is about 80% of you are already very familiar, which is amazing. Brilliant. From a school and young person's advocacy perspective. So that's really helpful. So yeah, again, that's helpful for Laura to know too, that you're some perspective. So thank you for taking part in that. What I'm going to do now is hand over to Laura. If you're able to share your slides, Laura. I'm going to take myself off screen so I'm not distracted, but I'll be on the chat if anybody needs anything.
Perfect. Right, I've got my Outlook reminders have just popped up as well, which is not very helpful. Hold on one second. Let's get rid of those. Why won't it let me get rid of them? Yes, sorry, I've got too many things covering it. Right, that should be working now. There we go. So
brilliant.
Tracy's already introduced me, so I won't talk too much about that. And all I will say as well is that I am a parent of a neurodivergent young man. So I have a son who is 21 now, who was diagnosed with ADHD when he was 12. And then I also received a diagnosis of ADHD at the age of 46. So I'm not just talking to you today as a professional, I'm also talking to you as a parent of a neurodivergent young person, and also I have personal experience of being neurodivergent myself. So neurodiversity covers obviously a very wide range of diagnosis, and I can't possibly talk about them all today. I'm not an expert on all of them anyway, but we've not got very long to talk about neurodiversity anyway. But I think just to clear up as well a little bit of sort of stuff around language, we talk about neurodiversity, neurodivergence, and neurodiversity and neurodiverse. Get my words all muddled up. If we're talking about a person who has one of these diagnoses on the screen now, they are neurodivergent. If we're talking about a group of people who have different neurotypes, then we're talking about neurodiversity, or neurodivergence. So just a little bit, if there's often you see that language, people say, oh, I've got experience of a neurodiverse child. Neurodiversity actually covers like a plural, a group of people. So just to cover that up, but yeah, it can cover all of these things here, and you're probably working with students with a whole range of those diagnoses as well. Also, again, you've all from the poll, I've seen that you've got, they've got a huge amount of experience here. Just something that's really, really important to understand about neurodiversity is that you often won't see when somebody is neurodivergent. I'm neurodivergent. People wouldn't necessarily look at me and realize that I'm neurodivergent, particularly if I'm in an environment where I feel very safe, very comfortable, very sort of regulated. But the other thing that's really important, just to sort of remind you, is that neurodivergent conditions such as autism, ADHD, all of those, etc., are covered by the Equalities Act. So that means that actually we have a legal responsibility in a school or in a place of work to make what we refer to as reasonable adjustments. And reasonable adjustments should be based on need and not diagnosis. So you've also probably got within your schools a very high number of students who don't actually have a formal diagnosis. Maybe that could be for various reasons. Maybe their parents don't want them to be diagnosed. My organisation, we do assessments for children and teenagers up to the age of 18. And it's quite common that we will have sort of 17, 18-year-olds coming to us who've actually sort of managed to navigate the school system without a diagnosis. As I said just now, schools still have to make reasonable adjustments for that young person. So there might be some stuff that comes up today and you think, oh, actually, do you know what, that would really help some of the students that I'm working with, even though they're not formally diagnosed with any kind of diagnosis. This is one of my favorite visuals in my training pack, and I put this in lots of the training that I do. Because what it shows is that actually when we're looking at the best way to support students, we should be looking at an equitable way of doing that rather than an equal way. And I think that reminds us that all of the students that you're working with, even if they share a diagnosis, they might have you might have two students that are both diagnosed autistic or two students that are both diagnosed with ADHD. They could actually present very, very differently and have quite different needs, and therefore need different support to help them meet their potential. So, you can see in the picture here, all the young people have been given the same support. They've all been given a box to stand on. This young person doesn't need the box. This young person, it hasn't quite done the job in allowing them to see over the fence. And then the third young person can't even use the box. So this is the way we should be thinking when we're looking at supporting neurodivergent learners, that we have to very much focus on them from an individual perspective and look at their individual needs. The other thing just to bear in mind about neurodiversity, and I've got this is talking about autism on this slide here, but it's actually the same again with any diagnosis, that we're looking at spectrums. Everybody who is neurodivergent will be somewhere different on the spectrum, but the other thing that we need to move away from is thinking that people are sort of low down the spectrum or higher up the spectrum, or high functioning or low functioning. It's actually a very, very unhelpful way of looking at any kind of diagnosis. So this is a far more helpful way of looking at any spectrum. And again, I've got an autism spectrum on here. But you could do the same with ADHD, dyslexia, etc. So this spectrum shows that actually the autism spectrum is very complex. There's lots of different ways that people are impacted or affected by being autistic. And if we consider the white dot in the middle as being kind of typical, a typical person who's not neurodivergent, and as we move out towards the sort of the labels here, the needs become more significant or more prevalent. If you were to support, any of your students, then and really sort of get to know them, you would realize that their needs would be dotted around all over this spectrum. And also something that's important to think about is that those needs change as well. And again, depending on the environment, depending on how comfortable the person feels, depending on how safe they feel. So I can tell you as a neurodivergent person that if I'm in an environment where I feel safe and my needs are being met and I'm comfortable with the environment, my needs might sort of be less obvious. I might be plotted sort of nearer the typical part of this graph. But when I don't feel safe, when I don't feel comfortable, when I don't feel that my needs are being met, then the plotting would probably take me further out. And that will be the same with any of your young people. So that's another reason why, we've really moved away from this very linear way of thinking about any kind of neurodivergent condition, because people move around on it all the time. So just some facts now about neurodiversity and mental health. So with ADHD, research has shown us that 30% of children with ADHD will also have a coexisting anxiety disorder. So I think sometimes individuals with ADHD they come across as being kind of like almost like overly confident sometimes. They can be quite loud, gregarious young people, but it does sort of hide the anxiety that they are experiencing. And then you can see again, research in ADHD shows that 70% of individuals with ADHD will be treated for depression at some point in their lives. And again, doesn't always sort of fit the mold of what we kind of think people with ADHD are like, because I know that I can come across as being incredibly confident. And the young people that I work with sometimes, as I say, they're very loud. They often will use sort of the mask of being very sort of confident and bold and loud and gregarious to cover up the anxiety that they are actually feeling. 80% of autistic individuals are likely to experience poor mental health at some time in their lives, and that means that research showed that 80% of autistic adults are treated at some point or are diagnosed with anxiety or depression. And I found a study by Mullay et al., quite a recent study, that showed that 92% of children who have challenges with school attendance are neurodivergent, which is absolutely huge. We just had some work done on our house actually, and the builder, really nice guy, he's got an autistic son, and the son started at secondary school 2 weeks ago. And he came around the other day and said that he was late and he was really sorry that he was late, but he'd taken his son to school and his son hadn't been able to get out the car, and said, "Oh, I'm just really, really worried that this is like the beginning of him not being able to go in." Sorry, one moment. I just let my cat out when Tracy and I were talking, and of course he wants to come back in. Come on, quick, quick. The study by Mullay also found that autistic children were 46 times more likely to experience school distress than their neurotypical counterparts. And as mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, the sort of area of autism that I specialise in is pathological demand avoidance. And back in 2018, the PDA Society did a study of almost 1,000 children with a PDA profile, and 70% of those children were not able to attend school. So it's, you know, you can see that there's a pattern here. There's a pattern with neurodivergent young people really struggling with attendance. What we also see in our clinic for assessments is that a lot of the children that we assess um, kind of coped and found their way through primary school relatively easily, but that actually the transition into secondary school was very, very difficult for them. You know, primary school is just generally feels safer for neurodivergent children when we're doing our assessments and we're talking to the children about why school is so hard for them. You know, they will say it's just so big, it's just so loud, there's just so many people. The number of transitions that children are expected to manage in a secondary school is huge as well. You know, they could be seeing 4 or 5 different teachers in 4 or 5 different classrooms a day. And then obviously there's like demands increasing with things like homework and exams as well. So in this presentation, you're going to see some illustrations which are from some of my books that are by a lady called Eliza Fricker. Eliza is also an author, and she wrote the Sunday Times bestseller Can't Not Won't, which is about her autistic child who wasn't able to go to school. And this is an illustration that basically sort of, I think, shows why school can be just so challenging for so many of our young people. You know, that autistic individuals, neurodivergent individuals, have a much higher baseline of anxiety anyway. And learning when you're anxious is really, really hard. You know, your brain can't learn, it can't concentrate when you feel anxious. And then some of the things that I've already mentioned, you know, it's so busy, there's strange smells, it's noisy, can be quite a lot of uncertainty as well. So it's no wonder that so many young people do find going to school a real challenge. What we also, as I say, we see this a lot in our clinic with young people really struggling to attend school, particularly after that transition into secondary. The autonomy that children have in their education decreases as you go through the education system. If you think about when you start in the education system, you start in, you know, nursery or reception, you have a lot of autonomy. You know, there's a lot of playing, there's a lot of being able to do things when you want, being able to sort of do the things that you want. And obviously, as you go through the system, that autonomy is gradually like removed. And again, this is something that a lot of the children that we talk to who are in secondary school say that they really struggle with, that by the time they get to secondary, they don't feel that they have any autonomy, that they feel that they're being sort of controlled and told what to do and where to be all the time. And it's very difficult for some young people. And also, obviously, the demands of education increase as children go through the school system as well. So, you know, homework demands increase, tests and exams become more important, and that can put pressure on children as well. So I think the school system can feel like a very, very unsafe place, unfortunately, for a lot of neurodivergent children. And then, of course, we put a lot of pressure. And I know that you guys are under pressure. I used to be a head teacher in a specialist school, and you know, we were constantly being asked for, you know, our attendance figures. And you know, I know that Ofsted are very hot on attendance, and you know, it can affect your reputation if your school attendance figures are not good. But again, that just puts a lot of pressure on children and parents to attend. And again, this is one of Eliza's illustrations, again from some other work we did together. And we put this on here because we'd been to do a conference in a school, and we walked into this school, and it was quite an imposing building with quite an imposing entrance area. And the first thing we saw when we walked in was like this board, which basically sort of laid out all the negatives of not being in school. And it was like this big poster saying, if you miss school, you miss out. And if you miss this many days, then your chances of getting these results in GCSEs sort of diminishes. And it was, I understand why it was there. And obviously children can't meet their potential if they're not learning, but at the same time, I think a lot of children will absorb that pressure. And then, of course, parents feel very pressurized by that as well. So we're going to talk about anxiety now. And I think this section here will be helpful, obviously, for neurodivergent students that you work with, but not all of your anxious students will be neurodivergent. You will have students that are experiencing anxiety for lots of other reasons as well. So, anxiety is basically your response to a threat or a perceived threat. And so you have a cognitive response to a stimulus. It could, as I say, could be anything. And then you will think sometimes quite, you'll think almost without thinking, oh, that's dangerous, that's going to put me in danger, that's going to put me at risk. You will then have your physiological response to the threat. So, butterflies in your tummy, heart racing really, really fast, dry mouth, sweaty under the arms. And then you'll also have your behavioral response to the threat as well, which could be fight or flight. It could be a freeze response. Other responses are flop, so like legs going not working, sort of getting jelly legs. Something that I would see in my school quite a lot was a flock response, which is when you get more than one anxious person, they sort of group together. So I would quite often end up with a little sort of gaggle of anxious students all sort of together in the playground at my school. But what I'd like to ask you now, if you don't mind sort of putting in the chat, is I just would love to know some of the things that cause you anxiety. So just like a couple of things that maybe make you feel very, very anxious or nervous or worried. So I will start by saying that I find being late incredibly anxious. I also find technology very anxiety provoking. So we've got Ofsted. Yes, Olivia, totally agree. Getting that phone call is not nice. Change. So lots of people saying change. Crowds, changing plans and routine, being late. Yeah, Emma, 100%. Sarah's with me on the being late. Lots of people worrying about being late. Speaking in a large group, uncertainty, new places. Yeah, I'm the same, Lee. I'm good at being late, or I'm so early that I then just have to sit there for hours and waste loads of time. New social situations, fear of failure, deadlines, lack of communication, not being good at my job, maybe to need to you mean that? Perhaps public transport, yeah, totally get that. The unknown, arriving late, time measurements, judgment, lack of structure, crowds, health anxiety, speaking in public, yeah, deadlines, technology, public speaking. Just trying to look at as many as I can. New schools and new staff, united playing football. Well, Steph, it's funny you said that because I get very, very anxious when my husband and my two sons all support different football teams, and I hate it when they're playing because I just know that they're not going to be happy. I'm like, "Oh." I tend to, yeah, I totally get that one. New tech, not being prepared for lessons, your workload, going somewhere, not knowing where to park, yeah, spiders, getting things wrong, inconsistency, crowds, making mistakes, fear of dying, public speaking, sickness, peer pressure. Right, I'm trying to get to the bottom. There's so many. Thank you. Forgetting something from your lesson plan. Self-checkouts. Yes, Caroline. I hate them. Shopping centres, getting lost. Yeah. Losing your phone. Yeah. Thinking if you've done anything wrong, not enough hours in the day, multitasking. Brilliant. Right. I can't possibly read them all, but thank you so much. These are all brilliant examples. And what's really interesting here, we've literally got hundreds of examples here. People eating, yes, I have that. Misophonia, it's horrible. Sometimes if people are eating next to me and they're really loud, I can't bear it. So we've got literally hundreds of examples here of anxiety. Nobody has really put anything that is a genuinely life-threatening situation. Okay, no one's put swimming with sharks or having to deal with an intruder when they come into my house at night. None of you have really put anything that's actually a situation that could put you at a genuine risk, but it does not matter. And this is really, really important when we're supporting anxious students, okay? If your brain perceives it as a threat, your brain perceives it as a threat. It doesn't matter whether it's actually putting you in danger or not, because your brain has perceived it as a threat. You're having those physiological sensations inside. You're having that behavioral response to either run away or, attack or hide or whatever it is. So this is really, really important to remember when we're supporting anxious individuals, okay? Because just because it doesn't make you anxious, or it might not even make anybody else anxious, we cannot invalidate the fact that it's making them anxious. Some of you have put public speaking, some of you have been asked direct questions. I've done school observations when I have seen children absolutely freeze on the spot because they've been asked a direct question by a teacher. And sometimes teachers will ask the child that doesn't seem to be contributing much, the child that's not putting their hand up, because they want to check they understand. I get that. But then that child will sit there absolutely crippled with fear because they think, oh, they're going to ask me a question, they're going to ask me, and it's just too much for them. It's just too difficult. So we absolutely have to validate people's anxiety, even if it doesn't make them feel anxious. There's so many things around anxiety that people have different responses to. Some people are scared of heights, other people love jumping out of airplanes, some people hate spiders, other people have tarantulas. We have to recognize and respect that anxiety is very, very personal, and if it makes someone anxious, it makes someone anxious. The other really helpful analogy to think of when we're supporting anxious individuals is using the bucket analogy. So some of your students that you're working with, particularly some of your neurotypical students, those students that just seem to have it all together, they will too have an anxiety bucket, but their bucket will have holes in it. Okay, so people who are neurotypical, people that are, generally cope with anxiety quite well, they will have lots of stuff entering their bucket every day, like the stuff that I've got in the illustration here. Because their bucket has holes in it, their bucket can constantly drain away. So for those people, it takes something very big or very unusual for their bucket to fill up. For those who are neurodivergent, or for those who have an anxiety disorder, and you can have an anxiety disorder, like a generalized anxiety disorder, without being neurodivergent, the bucket looks very different. It looks like this. There are either no holes or there's one little tiny pinprick hole. So what that means is that throughout the morning or throughout the day, the bucket is constantly filling up, filling up, filling up, filling up, filling up. So all this stuff going into the bucket means that throughout the day, the capacity of the bucket is gradually reducing. You might even have young people that are coming into your school whose buckets are really full when they get in, because they've had, just meeting the demands of getting into school has been too much for them. And now, because their buckets don't have holes in, the only way to allow the bucket to sort of leave the bucket is just to allow it to evaporate. So something that can be incredibly helpful when you're working with, particularly with neurodivergent learners, is really getting to understand and recognize the individual bucket fillers and their bucket emptiers as well. And then if you can reduce the fillers and increase the emptiers, you can increase the capacity of the bucket. But something that I've done with quite a lot of the young people that I work with who are in school is just suggested that when they come in the morning, they don't have to go straight into the classroom. They can have some time with a safe person in a safe place that just allows the bucket to evaporate a little bit before they then enter the classroom or have to go to assembly, or it might even be the first lesson is too difficult for them. But also just remember, for neurodivergent individuals, there'll almost always be anxiety in the bucket. Their bucket is probably never, ever completely empty, particularly when they're in school, because it is a challenging place for them to be in. It's also important to remember that when the bucket is very full, the cognitive ability will drop as well. And again, this is something that you can all probably relate to. You can all probably relate to times when you've been very stressed or anxious and you've not been able to remember your PIN number or your phone number or where you've parked your car or something, because your brain isn't functioning properly when you're anxious. Your brain is in survival mode. And again, this is really, really important to remember. If you're teaching anxious students, they're not going to be able to learn if they're really anxious, because their brains aren't capable of it. So it's another really reason why it's so important that they get that support that they need. And then it can also be really helpful to think about what you need when you're anxious. So I know when I'm anxious, I need really clear information. I can't do ambiguous when I'm anxious. I need to know exactly what's happening. I also need people to validate how I'm feeling, and to show me that they genuinely empathize with how I feel as well. Um, if someone's feeling really anxious and you just turn around to them and say, "Oh, you'll be fine. Come on, you've done it before," doesn't make them feel any better. Like, calm down has never made anybody in the history of the world feel calm. And I know that when I feel sort of anxious or worried about something and someone tells me to like calm down, stop worrying about it, it makes me feel worse. I'm like, you just don't get it. So I need people to say, no, I completely understand, you must be feeling really cross about that. Yeah, when that happened to me, I felt the same as you. Because then the person thinks, yeah, you're on my team, you get it. And if someone thinks that you get it and you're on their team, then they're more likely to think that you can support and help them as well. We also know there's a huge link between anxiety and control as well. And I've got some tips that can help with that a little bit later in the presentation. I think something else that can be really important to understand is that neurodiversity can also sometimes be mistaken for poor behavior. And I've just got an example here that can help sort of show that. So I'm using ADHD as an example. If you think about the characteristics of a good student in your setting, and feel free to, again, put some in the chat, but you're probably going to think of a student who is organized, who attends their lessons, who's punctual in their lessons, who focuses, who contributes, who makes notes of the homework, that does the homework and then hands it in on time. Those are probably the students that you love working with. Now, if you think about someone who has ADHD, all of those things that I've just mentioned are going to be a challenge for you because you've got ADHD. So, you could genuinely be sitting in a lesson trying really, really hard to focus and concentrate, but you just can't because your brain doesn't allow you to do it. And then you get like told off, for not concentrating, or you're sitting there and you're focusing so hard on, I must sit still, I must look at the front, I must listen, I must contribute. That again, you can't really learn because all of your energy and all of your focus is going on to sort of caving. So again, I think this shows why sometimes, being ADHD or having ADHD or just being neurodivergent, you can get into trouble when you actually haven't deliberately done anything wrong. And then this can create a lot of fear about going into school. If you get really behind with your homework, and then you're frightened that there's going to be a sanction because you haven't done your homework, then you might not go into school. Or the other thing that happens sometimes, particularly with ADHD, and this is something that my son used to do a lot, is he would distract from his difficulties by kind of like becoming the class clown, or sort of doing things, or sometimes deliberately getting himself sent out, like self-sabotaging as well, because that just detracted from the real issues, basically. But yeah, for a lot of neurodivergent students, just being in school and being authentic, being them, means that they're going to get into trouble. And then the opposite of being authentic is masking, and masking is something that we know a lot of autistic um, children and ADHD children do. There's been a lot of studies that have shown that there's a real link between masking, not being able to be your true authentic self, and mental health problems. So yeah, it's a tough environment. Um, the other aspect of ADHD, particularly, that is not really understood, is something called rejection sensitivity dysphoria. So studies have shown that 98% of individuals who have ADHD experience RSD, which is, as I say, rejection sensitivity. But again, very, very common within the neurodivergent sort of population as well. And there was a study done a few years ago by a psychologist who discovered that by the age of 12 years old, children with ADHD will have received 20,000 more negative comments than their neurotypical peers. And again, it sort of links back into what I was just talking about, constantly being told off because you're not sitting still, you're not concentrating, you've forgotten things that you need. So it's a bit of a nature nurture debate about where this RSD comes from. But this is all stuff that I can really, really relate to as well. So when you have RSD, you can become extremely sensitive to criticism. You think people don't like you. Obviously, that's going to make you anxious. Individuals who experience RSD are generally become people pleasers. They sort of befriend people because it keep them on side, less likely to be horrible to them. Again, that's going to impact on low self-esteem, avoidance of social settings, could be like a real fear of failure. So I'm not going to try because it might not go well. You might be on the receiving end of what appears to be an overreaction if you criticize or give someone with ADHD or someone who experiences RSD some negative feedback. So I think this is a really, really important part of ADHD, but also of neurodiversity for you to understand, because it means that we need to be incredibly careful with how we deliver feedback to certain students. And it could also explain why you get what, as I say, you perceive to be an overreaction when you tell a child off or reprimand them or tell them that their homework isn't up to par, when they've actually spent hours trying to focus on it, and they might really sort of explode. And you think, oh, goodness say that's another sanction now because they've sworn at you, when actually it could be that you've really triggered an RSD response in them. Another aspect of neurodiversity which can really impact on anxiety is the sensory needs and the sensory differences that particularly autistic students experience. And again, the more your sensory needs are sort of heightened, the worse your anxiety gets, and it sets up quite a vicious cycle. And a neurodivergent student can be under or oversensitive in all of these areas. So the obvious ones are sight, smell, touch, taste, and hearing, but the balance system can be impacted. So the vestibular system. Also, so that could affect, PE lessons can be very difficult if they've got to sort of balance. Proprioception. So proprioception is how you pick up the signals that your body is giving you about where it is in relation to environment. So a good example here is those of you that teach science. Sitting on a stool in a science lab can be quite difficult for somebody who has proprioceptive difficulties, because there's such a small part of their body actually kind of like grounded to the floor. And then also neurodivergent, particularly autistic individuals, might have difficulties with their interoceptive system as well. So feeling what's going on inside their bodies. So that can impact sort of understanding when you're tired, sorry, hungry, thirsty, need the toilet. So your students that say to you, can I go to the toilet, miss? And you say, why didn't you go at break time? They may genuinely not have felt like they needed to go at break time. And then the urge to go to the toilet comes on incredibly suddenly. Interoception can also really impact on the way that autistic, particularly individuals, feel their feelings. So again, a lot of our feelings, we know they're happening inside our body because, when we're anxious, for example, again, we get butterflies in our tummy. When we're angry, heart might race really, really fast. If you experience difficulties with interoception, then you might then experience something called alexithymia. And alexithymia means like not being able to give a name to emotions, basically. So again, you might be trying to support um, a student who's neurodivergent, and they generally may not know how they feel. They generally may not know that they've had this very angry outburst because they didn't experience it as anger. Other things, again, that can be difficult if you've experienced sensory difficulties, being very distracted and seeing things in the environment that other people don't notice, or smelling things other people don't notice. Crowds, so going into the canteen, going into sort of the changing rooms at to get ready for PE can be difficult. Sitting can be very difficult if you're neurodivergent, like, because again, there's proprioceptive difficulties. So again, getting told off for fidgeting or not sitting still. Not registering pain in an expected manner, difficulty with eating, so going into the canteen can be very challenging. And again, because of being autistic, may not be aware that their sensory responses are different to others. So I'm going to send you the slides after the presentation, and something for you to really think about afterwards is, thinking about your working environment. Are there any areas of it that you think actually could really impact somebody who processes the environment differently? And what reasonable adjustments do you think you could make to that environment to support children in your setting? So it could be just letting them sit somewhere different. It could be allowing them to transition between lessons, sort of, few minutes before or after other people, so that they're not going through in those very, very sort of busy corridors, maybe having their lunch in a separate room, maybe coming in a different entrance in the morning. All of those things are just really worth considering, and also talking to your students about as well. So one of my favorite analogies to sort of help us understand working with individuals is this iceberg theory of behavior. And just a reminder that with an iceberg, you only see about 10% above the water. 90% of an iceberg is below the surface. And the reason that most behaviour support in schools doesn't really work is because it only focuses on what we see. So it will focus on these things, the child's behaviour basically, but it doesn't focus enough on what's going on under the surface, and then it can be misinterpreted. So a student that's just displaying a lot of anxiety related behavior may not feel safe. They might be seeking trust in the people that they're working with. So you might be seeing some of that behavior now, particularly with your year sevens that have just joined school. They don't know who to trust yet. I really hate the phrase attention seeking. I think it's much more appropriate to rephrase it as connection seeking. And again, that's linked to that trust as well. If you're seeing a lot of demand avoidance, or what can sometimes look like oppositional behaviour, then that student could be trying to get some control back. And finally, a student that's displaying aggression, whether it's physical or verbal aggression, might actually be seeking space. Nearly all the young people that I work with tell me that when they feel really anxious, they need time and space. They don't verbalize that. They don't say, I'm terribly sorry, I'm feeling a bit anxious. Would you mind awfully giving me 5 minutes? They'll probably tell you to F off or to storm off, but that's their way of getting that time and space that they need. So supporting a student whose bucket is full, supporting those students who, their they can't cope with the environment anymore is really, really important. First of all, try not to personalize it. It's probably not about you. You're probably just the teacher or the LSA happened to be with them when that bucket got filled up, and the bucket's probably been filling up all day. We definitely don't want to start talking about threats or sanctions when somebody's feeling anxious. It's not going to make them feel better. It's going to only escalate the situation. Similarly, shouting will as well. But emotions are very contagious. If we keep calm, lower our voice, less language, then we can actually help the student feel calmer as well. I mentioned this already, but empathizing and validation is so important. For some of your students, distraction and humor might work. It's very much sort of individually on the individual there. Some of them they might not feel that you're taking them seriously. You definitely need to avoid negotiating during a meltdown. As I mentioned earlier, the brain stops processing properly when somebody is feeling very anxious. So actually, too many people talking, too many words, too much language is probably going to make them worse. Sometimes you have to be really flexible. You need to think outside the box, and obviously safety is absolutely paramount. We need to make sure we're keeping everyone safe, including you guys as well. This is a grounding technique which can be really helpful to teach your students if they become very, very overwhelmed and anxious. And it's probably something to practice doing before they get there as well. So it's very, very simple. You keep the student hopefully in a place that's quite safe, and you ask them to sort of look around and really tune into their environment. And then ask them to sort of name 5 things that they can see, 4 things they can touch or feel, 3 things they can hear, 2 things they can smell, and 1 thing that they can taste. I've also done this by getting students to imagine they're in what I call their happy place. So I asked them to sort of think of somewhere where they felt very safe, where they felt very relaxed, and to do that exercise there. And I've actually printed out cards with this as a reminder on for some of my students as well, and that's been really helpful for them. Another analogy that I love is the kettle analogy. So when a student has been in crisis, they are going to need time to cool down again afterwards. And a good way to think about this is when you boil your kettle for the first time in the morning, your kettle probably takes maybe 2 or 3 minutes to boil. Once the water in the kettle is hot, it will take probably half an hour, 45 minutes to go back to room temperature again. That's the minimum amount of time it's going to take a student to calm down if their adrenaline levels have been raised significantly. And again, thinking about the kettle, once the water in the kettle has boiled, if you press the on button when the water is still warm or hot, it will boil up again much more quickly the second time. So if a student who's been in crisis has to go back into the environment that triggered them, or even a different environment that triggers them, and their adrenaline levels are still high, then they're probably going to go back into crisis again. So this is another reason why that time and space is really, really important. And I also appreciate that time, as in people, resources, and space are often, difficult to find. But again, if they go back into a classroom environment where they've been triggered, it's probably going to happen again. So choices can be really helpful. I mentioned earlier there's a connection between control and anxiety. So just sort of tweaking our language sometimes can be really, really helpful. So instead of saying things like sit down, start your work, go and get changed, we could offer our students a choice. So would you like to sit here or here? Which piece of work would you like to start with? Do you want to get changed now or after lunch? The student will feel that they've got more autonomy, and they will feel that they've got a greater amount of control if we do that. And one of my absolute favorite choices to offer, and this again could be for work, but it could also be if somebody is really struggling with their emotions, is do you need some time and just be left alone? Or can I help? Do you need some support? So again, you could use that in different settings, but I just think that gives the student that sense of autonomy and control that they will need. And as I mentioned just a moment ago as well, we need to be careful that we're not overloading an anxious student or a student that's struggling with their emotions with too much language. So these are really helpful techniques. These are actually assertiveness techniques, but again, helpful with your RSD students as well, that may not respond very well to sort of the, being told off publicly. just keeping it very factual. When you shout out, it disrupts the lesson. I know you like to share your ideas. If you put your hand up, I'd love to hear your answer. And then you could finish that with a thank you. And then similar, when you don't hand your work in, I feel concerned that you don't understand the topic and you're getting behind. And then I need you to try and get the first part in this week, and then we can look at it together. You're using a lot less language. You're showing empathy around their situation, but you're also offering a solution as well. And then just finally, I think the two things that all the students and young people that I work with who are in school, and I only work with neurodivergent students, but the two things that they absolutely have to have in school is a safe person and a safe place. That they know that they can access when their anxiety is really, really high. And I think without those, you know, school is going to be a lot more of a challenging place. So helping particularly your new students that are coming in identify a safe person and identify a safe place is really, really important. And then also for students that are experiencing ESPA, which is EBSA, emotionally based school avoidance, ragging the timetable can also be really helpful. One, in identifying those parts of the day that are really, really triggering for them. Secondly, maybe then offering them a reduced timetable. So sitting down with them and you colour in the timetable. Red are the absolutely no, can't do it. Don't make me ever, please. Orange are the or amber, tricky, but I'll give it a go. And then green are the no, I really like that part of the day. I really like that lesson. And make sure you're including like breaks and lunch times in that as well. So that was a very quick presentation. Just finished just on time, I think. I hope it was helpful. I've just got that's the links to my very busy Facebook page and Twitter and my books as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Laura.
My pleasure.
People were saying it was really resonating with, with what they're experiencing themselves and in school. We can see lots of little hearts and claps arising.
I've
I
never
love
seen
that.
that before. That's lovely. Thank you. I love
Isn't
the
that
hearts.
sweet? So that's
Really sweet.
fantastic. Thank you. Really great. Oh my gosh. We have one question in the Q&A already.
Yeah, I'm just going to stop sharing actually.
I think I could probably talk to you for about another 2 hours about this, but anyway, we'll try and keep it to 10 minutes. Firstly, I just wondered, you mentioned, that reasonable adjustments should be based on need, not diagnosis. So in your opinion then, when you're working with neurodivergent students, is it, but you're not looking for a diagnosis to make these, reasonable adjustments to,
I
you
think
don't need
there
that
is,
technically.
yeah, I mean, obviously there are some students that will need a diagnosis. There are some students that will need an EHCP as well. But I have worked with some schools that have done absolutely amazing work with young people that actually don't have a diagnosis, but they've recognized that actually, giving them a safe space, allowing them to transition a few minutes before the lesson finishes so they can go when it's quieter has made a really massive difference. And the student doesn't need a diagnosis for you to be able to do that.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So I will ask you to share your slide at your end slide, right?
Oh, okay.
I think a few people were
That's fine. I'll put it back
to
up.
get your details and things like that and some of your recommendations. So that's great. Thank you. So one of the questions I have is, what do you recommend to help neurodiverse pupils quieten down at the start of a lesson so they can complete the task ready on the board? I mean, maybe that is a step too far, possibly. But yes, any thoughts on that?
With that, I would be looking at what they've been doing before they come into the lesson. Because if a student has had like a PE lesson where they've been able to be very lively and quite loud, and then they've got to transition straight into a lesson where they've got to sit down and focus and be quiet, that transition could be really, really difficult for them. So I would be sort of thinking, can they have a movement break before they've got to come in and sit down? Or, can they have some time between the lessons just to go and do something which allows them to sort of just just to support with that transition, basically, because it can be really, really difficult.
Absolutely.
Or even it could be get them to give out the books, or get them to give them a job at the start of the lesson, so that they're not having to sit, but you're not necessarily making a big point of it, that they can be moving around in a way that's quite it looks like it's part of the lesson and actually could be quite helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you mentioned the grounding, the 5 4 3 2 1 technique. Any other suggestions for
Yeah,
anxious
so
children, diverse,
breathing.
neurodiverse, or typical, really?
Yeah, so some breathing techniques. So there's one where you just use your hands, and you've always obviously, you've always got a hand with you, and you breathe in as you go up, and then out as you go down. Tapping as well, so closing the eyes and just
Mm,
focusing on tapping can also be really helpful as well, just a distraction. So I've sat with students that have been very dysregulated and sort of said, right, count back from 100 and tap as you're counting, and then they have to focus so much on the counting backwards and the tapping, they actually can't think about the thing that's making them anxious. It just gives their
yeah,
brain a little bit of a break.
yeah. In terms of the students themselves in schools, what is the term neurodivergent? How is it received by young people? Is it something that they are, is it being widely used by young people? Is it an accepted term, or is it maybe stigmatized at all? Or
I
what's your sense of young people's view of neurodivergence?
I think it's becoming less stigmatized, but I think it would also really depend on the young person's kind of like how their family views neurodiversity as well. So
Mm,
I work with some families who are incredibly positive about neurodiversity, and they recognise there's lots of other neurodivergent members in the family, and they're very positive about it. But I've also worked with families that have said, no, we don't want to label our child.
yeah.
We don't want them to. I mean, I worked with one family whose son was diagnosed autistic when they were younger, and they never told him. And then, of course, he went through the
Um,
school system and, you know, started to really, really struggle.
mm,
Um, I think that all schools should do like assemblies celebrating neurodiversity and be very, very open about it as well. There's so many incredibly successful, quite well-known people now who are neurodivergent, and I think there's so many positives about neurodiversity that we should be
mm,
celebrating it and just seeing it as a difference, not a disability.
yeah. Um, I love this question. What reasonable adjustments could be helpful when it comes to homework? Sometimes the volume of work can be really difficult for students with ADHD. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think not having to do it is I know that's not always a possibility. I think offering time in school to support with homework. I know again, for someone with ADHD, it can be just feel utterly overwhelming, and the kind of procrastination will kick in. They don't know where to start. For some of my autistic students, they're very black and white, and they compartmentalize, and they're saying, well, no, school is for school and home is for home, and they're
mm,
exhausted when they get home. So I think offering homework clubs, trying to reduce the amount they've got to do, but offering support in school as well, so that they've got someone there that can help them. And also the environment is like, yeah, I'm still in school, so I'm going to do my homework.
mm.
But I
Okay,
mean,
great.
I'm not a massive fan of homework, I'm afraid. I see how much stress and anxiety it causes a lot of the neurodivergent children I work with. And actually, I know children that have stopped going to school because they've got behind with homework. They've been so worried about going in without having done it and getting into trouble.
Yeah.
And then they don't go in, and then they miss the lesson. So then they miss the input for the next bit of homework, and it can really quickly escalate.
Well, I'm going to do a shameless plug here. Here at Brainwaves, we're
Do it.
literally just starting a research study into belonging and attendance. That's what it's called, belonging and attendance, and it's that research into attendance problems and and its relationship with mental health. So yeah, we're very excited about that, and I feel like I have to get you signed up to help with that, Laura. Actually,
I would absolutely love to. Absolutely love to,
um,
yeah.
One final question, because I hope the answer is a really positive one. So the question is, well, it often feels like we have to get how we help neurodivergent young people right the first time. But is it possible to build bridges that feel like they might have been burned?
Yeah,
I
I
think that's
think
an interesting question.
yeah, you know, look, you're not going to get it right every time, and I think actually one of the best things that we can do is admit our own mistakes and apologize as well. I think, you know, a lot of children, not just neurodivergent children, look at adults and think that we've got it all sus, we're perfect, we know all the answers, and we don't ever make mistakes. That can put them under more pressure. You know, being able to say, look, I've really messed up here, I've got it wrong, and I'm really sorry. Next
Yeah,
time I'm going to try to do X, Y, Z is a really valuable thing for any young person to hear.
absolutely, I agree. Something I practice quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean it's yeah, we don't get it right all the time. I'm just looking at seeing if there's any more questions. Sorry, I'm messing up the
No, no problem at all. I think we've got through the questions that we've had. A
brilliant.
bit a bit fast fire there, but thank you very much for that. It's 5 o'clock, so we're going to draw to a close now. Quickly, we'll launch the poll to see oh, the usefulness of the webinar for
Yeah, I don't
everybody
want to look at
still
this
left.
because it will trigger my RSD. So I don't want to know the
Oh,
outcome.
you're absolutely fine. We've got about 90% saying it's very useful, and the rest are saying
Oh,
it's
good.
quite useful. So that I think we've had some good impact there, Laura. Thank you for that. I did also want to tell you everybody really quickly about our next webinar, which is happening on Wednesday, the 16th of October, where we've got the two professors, John Gallagher and Sarah Baumeister from the Brainwaves research team, telling us about the initial findings from our very first adolescent mental health study. We had over 7,000 students take part in this study earlier in the year, and some of the findings are really quite interesting. There's a lot in there about neurodiversity. There's a lot in there about agency and belonging. And so we're very excited about that. So please do feel free to join us if you can. Tara, if you're able to post the link for that in the, oh, she's amazing. So there we go. I am going to, and I'm sorry, yeah, thank you for doing that, Tara. We will be sending around a recording of this. So the only thing I have left to do is very quickly say a huge thank you to Laura for an
My
amazing
pleasure.
presentation today. I think it's been
Thank you.
superb, absolutely superb. And thank you to everybody for attending. We appreciate your time, we appreciate your commitment, and I do hope you found the session really useful, and will, you know, go some way to supporting the students with neurodiversity in your schools and organizations. So thank you everybody again. Great to see you. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you at another webinar soon. Thanks very
Yeah.
much.